Hello, I'm Bill Lawson. I'm Executive Director of the Mahoning Valley Historical Society, and welcome to this month's edition of Bites and Bits of History, sponsored by the John and Loretta Hynes Foundation. A couple of announcements before we get started. Tyler History Center and Arms Family Museum, where we are today, are both still closed to the public due to the spread of the coronavirus. We plan on opening as soon as we feel it's safe enough and allow people back into both of our sites. If you missed our Cookie Table and Cocktails at Home video premiere in late February, you can still watch it. It's an excellent production. Please visit our channel on YouTube for Mahoning Valley Historical Society or our Facebook page to link up to the video. Today's program is in honor of Women's History Month, and it's called Remarkable Women of Trumbull County, presented by Meghan Reed. Meghan Reed is director of the Trumbull County Historical Society, a role she has been in since 2015. She holds a master's degree in public history from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro and specializes in developing museums as community assets. In 2017, Meghan was honored as the Ohio Museums Association's Emerging Museum Professional of the Year. A native of Pittsburgh, she now is a proud resident of Warren, Ohio. And let's head up to the John Stark Edwards house in Warren to join Meghan Reed.
Hi everyone, my name is Meghan Reed and I work for the Trumbull County Historical Society in Warren, Ohio. March is Women's History Month, and for this segment we will be talking about 4 notable, significant, and unsung women from Trumbull County. Trumbull County, and Warren in particular, has a very wide history of being on the progressive end of social justice movements. From the Underground Railroad and abolition in the 19th century to, of course, suffrage, with Warren being the national headquarters for the National Women's Suffrage Association in the 20th century. The women that I'm going to talk about today were all influenced by the politics, the economics, and the social scene in Warren. They were all part of an era that saw Warren developing as an industrial and manufacturing powerhouse, and in their own unique ways, adapted to that world to be the movers and the shakers and really contribute in very tangible ways to a society that was not used to women taking on significant leadership positions. They all left a mark on our community that can still be felt today. But the first woman that I'd like to talk about also made a note on the national scene as well. We're going to do these women in alphabetical order, to be fair, and we're going to start with A, and Alaska Packard, who is noted as the very first female special FBI agent in the United States. Alaska was born into a very wealthy, very highbrow family in Warren. Most viewers have probably heard of the Packard brothers before. It was her brothers, J.W. and W.D., who of course started the Packard Electric Company and the Packard Motor Car Company. Alaska is one of the unsung heroes of the Packard family. She had very little formal education, almost certainly no college education, but her mother was very highly educated, very progressive, and it is thought that Alaska had a pretty well-rounded education just based on the travel and the culture that she learned from her family. She seems to have really put her mind to tasks, and it was important for her to have things done well. This is exemplified particularly in her early years when she was an equestrian, and she excelled as a horsewoman. In 1890, when she was just 22 years old, her brothers hired her as the superintendent of the New York and Ohio Company, which was a subsidiary of Packard Electric. In 1890, she was the very first female superintendent there. And this must have given Alaska confidence in her work and in her abilities and in her gumption to be a woman working in a man's world. It wasn't until the age of 54 that she really made her mark nationally. When she was 54, she was looking for a new adventure, And in 1922, Alaska was hired as the first female field agent for the Bureau of Investigation, along with two other women, and I am going to name them because I think they are equally as important. Jessie Duckstein and Lenore Houston. Alaska operated out of the newly formed Washington, D.C. field office. She was considered a refined woman, and she was not given any thoroughly rough assignments. She was paid $7 a day for the detection and prosecution of crimes. Forced to resign when J. Edgar Hoover became director in 1924. Of course, J. Edgar Hoover is very well known for not allowing women to work under him. Alaska was seen as a pioneer in law enforcement and, of course, federal agencies across the board for women. The FBI went without female field agents for decades. It wasn't until 1972 that they hired another female field agent, and her name was Susan Malone. Recently, we found correspondence in the collection of the Library of Congress between suffragists Carrie Chapman Catt, other Warrenite Harriet Taylor Upton, and Alaska, talking about Alaska's time in the FBI. In 1927, Upton claimed success at getting Alaska her job with the FBI, and she quotes, "She worked under William J. Burns, the great man, and she did a corking job!" Exclamation point. It was the kind of job she could do. And that's Alaska Packard. We're going to move on to our second notable woman from Trumbull County. And our second woman is Carrie Green Mountain. And what's interesting about Carrie, just to start off with, is that we don't actually know when she was born. She was born enslaved in Maryland, and the closest date that historians have given her for her birthday is 1857, but that's a rough guess. She arrived as one of the very first Black residents of Warren in the 1870s, and she arrived with her husband, his name was Lewis Green, and with the family of a Captain Day, and she worked as a wet nurse for Day's family. Carrie soon became known as a domestic worker for many local prominent families. She served in the Packard household and also in the Hughes household. Many viewers may know the Hughes mansion in Warren. And while she worked with these families, they would give her gifts and items for the work that she did, and just items that they no longer used. And because of her work, she was able to purchase her own home in Pine Street in Warren in 1892. And she's thought to be the very first Black woman in Warren to own her own property. When she passed away in 1948, over $30,000 in cash was found in her house. That is today the equivalent of over $325,000. She left that money to the Salvation Army, and those funds were used to build their building that they still operate out of on Franklin Street today. Carrie gave the Salvation Army the funds because she had a son named Raymond Green, and Raymond was incredibly well known both locally and nationally. He was a professional piano player on the vaudeville circuit and played with such names as Harry Houdini. But he passed away due to what they called at the time, his cause of death was alcoholism. This was the height of temperance, and many churches at the time locally refused to bury him, and it was the Salvation Army that agreed to give him a proper burial. And after that, Carrie was a member with the Salvation Army the rest of her life. There is some information that has been published about Carrie that I question, that I would like to include here. She was known as a bit of a reclusive person and is remembered today in many newspaper articles as a bit paranoid. She would sleep on the first floor of her home with a revolver to guard the money that she kept in her house. The part of the story that I feel is left out is that as a Black woman at the time, no bank would have had Carrie as a client. She had no real choice but to keep cash in her home, that much cash in her home. And she was, I think, very understandably terrified of somebody trying to break in and steal her livelihood. She lived right downtown, right behind where the Horseshoe Bar is today. It would have been a very bustling area of town at the time. And it could have been a dangerous area if people knew she had $30,000 in her house. There's also a photo of her as an older woman that survives, of her in a garden with a printed flower dress on. And I look at that image and have a hard time seeing her as the kind of taciturn, cranky person that she has been remembered for. And I wonder how much of her reputation in the community has been built off of misunderstandings of why she acted how she did. And that's Carrie Green Mountain. Our third significant and notable woman is Zell Hart Deming. And Zell transformed Warren's daily newspaper from a minor local circulation to a nationally syndicated newspaper. She was born in 1869 in Trumbull County, but she left about 1890 and moved to Chicago with her husband, Frank Hart. Frank died just 3 years after their marriage, and she moved back to Warren at that time with her daughter, Helen. She began to work at the Tribune as the society editor. It was called the Warren Tribune at the time. But by 1907, she had worked her way up to hold the positions of secretary, treasurer, president, and general manager, and she owned a controlling share in the company. In 1924, she bought the Warren Daily Chronicle, and she was responsible for merging the two papers to create the Warren Tribune Chronicle that we have today. Deming was a huge proponent of women's suffrage and used her paper as a platform to get women's right to vote. She asked Harriet Taylor Upton to write pro-suffrage articles that she published and served as treasurer for the Ohio Suffrage Association when Harriet Taylor Upton served as president of that association. On the national scale, Deming is arguably most known for being the very first woman inducted into the Associated Press. On a more local scale, she is known for 3 generations of women leading the Tribune Chronicle. Her daughter, Helen Hart Hurlburt, is widely remembered for her time as the owner after her mother passed and is arguably just as famous as her mother is in many ways. And Helen's daughter, Zell Draz, named after her grandmother, was the 3rd generation of women in that family to take on ownership of the paper after her mother died. And that is Zell Hart Deming. All right, the 4th woman that we are going to talk about is Zella McBurdy. Of the women that we're talking about today, Zella McBurdy is probably the most unsung woman of the people that we're talking about from Trumbull County, but in many ways, she really lit a path for women locally to enter the professional field. She was born in 1879 in Mineral Ridge, and she was orphaned at a very young age. No real records survive of her early life. We don't know how her parents died, and we don't know why she came to Warren. But we know by the time she was 16 years old, she was working at Packard Electric. It was during her time at Packard Electric that she must have learned the in and outs of mechanics and how to work in a factory. She married her husband, who was also working at Packard Electric, in 1909. Her husband was Fred McBurdy. And they moved into a home on Washington Street that still exists today. Her husband, of course, when she met him, was employed by Packard Electric, but that was after he worked at a variety of jobs for electric welding companies. And in 1907, the company that he was working for merged with the Federal Machine and Welder Company, and he became the manager of that company. And his wife was right there with him. She served as secretary and treasurer of the company, and together the McBurdys grew Federal Machine Welding to be the largest electric welding company in the entire world. A newspaper article in 1923 states that she started in the business world at 16 and could manage a lathe, scraper, or any machine as well as her workmen. And my absolute favorite quote from her also comes from that article in 1923. And I quote, "Manufacturing and selling electric welding machines seems rather out of woman's province. But when you hear Mrs. McBurdy talk ohms and amperes as well as any electrical engineer, there's hardly a business realm that a capable woman cannot invade." That is from the Newcastle Herald in 1923. She was the only woman to attend the International Convention of Electrical Engineers in the 1920s. She served on the association of the Cleveland and Warren Electrical Engineers Association, and she was a member of the London Association of Electrical Engineers. And in addition to that, she very much understood the importance of her work as a woman in what was traditionally a man's profession. She was very active with the Warren Professional and Business Women's Association and with a few different women's clubs in Warren, including the Zonta International, which is an international association dedicated to helping women in the professional field. Later in her life, she did talk about her professional work, and she credited her success to her instincts, being able to naturally know if someone would pay their bills or not. She seemed to refuse to sell to anybody she thought couldn't pay, but just based on her first impression of them, and seemed to be very self-assured, very confident, very capable. And based on what we know from newspaper articles written at the time and the speeches that she gave at international conferences, she seemed to also be a very inspiring woman to other women in the professional field at the time. This is a woman mentioned in newspapers from Detroit to Ithaca, New York, for her groundbreaking role as a higher up in the business realm. As a side note, and for any historic house lovers out there listening, I would like to take a moment and mention Harriet Taylor Upton. We talked about her a few times throughout this presentation, and I wanted to pay homage to other more unsung women in Trumbull County, but I do think we would be doing a disservice to Upton if she was not mentioned in this presentation at all. Upton broke ground in Warren for it to be socially acceptable for women to be at the forefront of politics. Upton served as the treasurer for the National American Women's Suffrage Association, and through her work with that organization, brought the national headquarters to Warren for 6 years. Today, the Harriet Taylor Upton Association preserves Upton's memory and her contributions, and they work out of Upton's home here in Warren, and it is open for tours throughout the year in non-COVID times. For more information on the Upton Association and when they will be open for tours, please visit uptonhouse.org. And for more information on the Trumbull County Historical Society, please visit us at trumbullcountyhistory.org or on Facebook or Instagram. Thank you.
Please join us next month in April. We'll be presenting April 1861, 160 years later, with Tracy Manning, our Curator of Education, and that will be on Thursday, April 15th.